Mark's account of the Gospel of Jesus through the first 10 chapters has covered over 2 years of his earthly ministry beginning in Galilee. The pace of his account now slows down to cover the last few days. It's almost like Mark was in a hurry to get us to Jesus' last trip to Jerusalem for the climax of the gospel story. After leaving Jericho, Jesus, his disciples, and a crowd following him arrived at the villages of Bethpage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives. Mark's narrative in chapter 11 begins by describing the preparation for and the dramatic entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. This time, to exercise his authority as king of his kingdom, for all to experience the introduction of a new covenant between God and his people, prophesied in Jeremiah 31 through 33. There's no desire to minister in outlying villages or to speak in parables that are not understood about who he is and why he has come. His disciples will witness the fulfillment of prophecy and all that Jesus had told them that would happen to him in Jerusalem. In just 4 days' time of the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread will begin. This feast is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts that the Jews from everywhere were expected to celebrate in Jerusalem together. The population of Jerusalem explodes to hundreds of thousands of people to celebrate the Jews' release from slavery to the Egyptian rulers. The fulfillment of prophecy begins with Jesus' entrance into the city. Zechariah 9:9, written some 500 years earlier, called for the people of Jerusalem to rejoice greatly and shout in triumph because their victorious king is coming to the city bringing salvation. He will be riding on a never-ridden donkey. 2 of Jesus' disciples go into the village, and by the power of eminent domain a king would have, secure a donkey colt for Jesus' triumphal procession into Jerusalem to receive his recognition as king. Using his disciples' own garments as a saddle, he rides into Jerusalem among shouts of Hosanna, which means save us, from the crowd that followed him. They were anticipating the restoration of the kingdom of David, shouting, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David," Mark 11:10. They were thinking, of course, of the messianic kingdom promised to David's son in 2 Samuel 7:11 through 14, which they interpreted as a political kingdom of military might to release them from Roman oppression at that time and protection from any foreign power in the future. That was the crowd's and the disciples' expectation of the promised Messiah. The next several days would dramatically change their thinking. Jesus is king of a different kind of kingdom. Luke records in Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44, that Jesus the King cried, knowing what would happen to Jerusalem and the temple in the future. Once in Jerusalem, Jesus goes directly to the temple courts. An elevated area of 35 acres within Jerusalem is held in place with retaining walls. This is the temple that began by Herod the Great in 19 BC. It is the most holy site of Judaism. The first temple was built by King Solomon, 2 Chronicles 3:1, which was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar in 585 BC, then rebuilt partially by Zerubbabel and Nehemiah in 516 BC. Mark records that Jesus just looked around watching what was happening before leaving with the 12 disciples to Bethany for the evening. I suspect they spent the night at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Seems like an anticlimactic result of such a triumphal entry into the city. Big changes began the next day. The Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread generated significant money for the temple and the Sadducees under the authority of the high priest, who controlled its activity. The Jewish pilgrims were by law required to pay a temple tax. They would need to secure a lamb or a dove for women for the sacrifice which they could purchase at the temple in the court of the Gentiles. But first, they would need to exchange their Greek or Roman pagan currency for temple currency, Tyrian shekels, good only for the temple banking system and economy. That is why there were money changers in the temple courts. The exchange rate, of course, included a significant profit for the money changers. A similar transaction occurs today when you travel to a foreign country and exchange American dollars for the currency of the country you are visiting. The Sadducees authorized who could set up shop as a money changer in the court of the Gentiles. Like any profit-motivated institution, the Sadducees would ensure they maximized their profit when authorizing someone to set up a money-changing booth. Upon entering the temple the next day, Jesus executes judgment on the nation of Israel by driving the money changers and buyers and sellers of sacrificial animals out of the temple and not even letting anyone transporting merchandise to walk through the temple. Jesus' disdain for those attempting to profit from the worship of God made his position clear. It is not tolerated, and judgment is severe. God's design for the temple worship was for a house of prayer for all nations, Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. Men corrupted and polluted God's design for the purpose of worship. Jesus rejects the hypocritical pretense of worship for God from a motive to make a profit. This type of corruption and pollution of worship continues today, and Christians need to be aware. The response of the crowd in the temple is amazement at the authority of his teaching and in his actions. The response of the chief priests, the Sadducees, rabbis, scribes is fear that Jesus is winning crowds over, and their position of power and authority over the people is diminishing rapidly. On the way to the temple this day, Jesus used a fig tree as an object lesson for his disciples to teach them on fruit-bearing, faith, and forgiveness. While much has been written on the fig tree object lesson, much of it seems to confuse people rather than instruct. This results in many Bible studies of this passage to veer off on tangents of little, if any, significance. Reading verses 12, 13, and 14 together with verses 20 through 25 in context of how Jesus uses parable, metaphor, and hyperbole in his teaching throughout the gospel record, the following is clear. The fig tree represents the nation of Israel, God's chosen people to bear fruit for him. It had the appearance of bearing fruit, but the absence of any fruit is a failure on the part of God's people. The curse on the tree by Jesus is his judgment on the nation of Israel for not bearing any fruit. The result of the curse is the rapid death of the tree down to its roots, total destruction. This would happen in 70 AD when Rome destroyed the temple. There was no more sacrificial system for sin. There was no more political elite like the Sadducees, and religious elite like the Pharisees, or court of judgment like the Sanhedrin. The purpose of the temple, as Jesus points out, was to be a house of prayer for all nations, bearing fruit. The temple still stood, but had been corrupted and polluted into a house of unscrupulous merchant practices. The command to have faith in God is the only proper response to the destruction of the nation of Israel. It is God's will, and he knows what is best for his good purpose. If you ask in prayer, believing that God has the power to fulfill your request, and it is within God's will, he can do it. The prayer of audacious belief in God's power is to the extent that God can make the seemingly impossible possible. And while praying, make sure you have forgiven others of any offense against you, so that God may forgive you of your sins. God's purpose for his people then, the Jews, and now Christians, is for them to, 1, have audacious faith in God, 2, bear fruit for his glory, praise, and honor, and 3, forgive those who sin against you as he forgives you. Take some time to reflect on how you're doing. The next day, Jesus and his disciples arrived in Jerusalem after the teaching on the fig tree and went directly again to the temple courts. While walking in the courts among the people, the Sadducees, scribes, and elders approached Jesus and challenged his authority to do what he had done in the temple. They asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? The authority of Jesus has been a source of amazement by the crowds and fear by the Jewish elite from the beginning of Mark's book. Read back at Mark 1:22. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Jesus makes complete control and responds with a proposition for them to consider. He will answer their question if they will answer his question. Jesus challenges them to answer a question concerning the baptism taught and performed by John the Baptist. Was it from heaven or man-made in origin? Jesus commands them to tell him. In trying to answer Jesus, they discover they're between a rock and a hard place. An answer from heaven brings shame and disgrace upon them for not believing John. They would be exposed to the crowd as hypocrites. If they answer of man-made origin, the people will be against them because they believe John was a prophet. They do not care about the truth, only what is politically expedient. The only safe answer for them is to respond, "We don't know." Jesus does not answer their question, but he does speak to them in a parable that they will understand. We can relate to fear of submission to a higher authority. Most of us like to feel we're capable of independently making our own decisions without submission to another. Matthew records these last words of Jesus to his disciples just before the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Matthew 28:18. How are we doing with that? Especially that three-letter word, all. Chapter 11 has set the stage for and the context surrounding the fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures concerning the identity and purpose of the promised Messiah in the person of Jesus. His confrontations with the political and religious elite will now grow in intensity and hostility. They know they must somehow destroy Jesus. Complete lesson 11 in your study guide, and I'll see you next time to examine what is their problem.